Good morning, everyone. I am delighted to welcome so many of you to this second webinar of the Morgan Hunt Diversity and Inclusion series. Our theme this morning is building inclusive teams for growth. And this morning we will explore how to practice inclusive team coaching. My name is Clare Keniry and I'm the director at Morgan Hunt responsible for the technology recruitment business. I also take a lead on diversity and inclusion at Morgan Hunt. As recruiters, we work very hard with our clients to develop inclusive recruitment strategies. And I'm thrilled to introduce you once again to our two team and executive coaching experts who are joining us to lead this session this morning. Firstly, I'd like to introduce you to Lucy Widdowson. Lucy is an executive team and leadership development coach. She's director of Performance Edge and a lead tutor on team coaching at the Henley Business School. Over her 30-year corporate career, Lucy worked at board level and as a HR director, leading award-winning teams herself. I'd also like to welcome back Paul Barbour. Paul is the co-author of a recently published book with Lucy titled Building Top Performing Teams. He is an executive leadership and team coach, and he developed his interest in the psychology of teams during his successful 20-year career at the Keniry Group, which is a global food business. So before we kick off, a quick word on our format this morning. The webinar will take about an hour. Our main session with Lucy and Paul will last about 45 minutes, and then we hope to have about 10 to 15 minutes at the end for Q&A. To ask questions, please use the Q&A function on Teams and post your question there. We will do our best to cover as many of your questions as possible. However, I may see your question, they may well not all be published. It's all about time allowing really at the end. So also just to mention, we may ask, or Paul and Lucy may ask during the session for you to use the Q&A function to put in comments or reactions to some of the things they're saying. And again, just post there. So it's my great pleasure now to hand you over to Lucy Widdowson.
Thank you so much, Claire, and a warm welcome to everyone on this webinar. So we're going to be building on some of the key themes raised at the last D&I session. And we're going to be focusing around how do you really build inclusive teams? And we're going to share some of our research from our new book as well, and also some of our corporate experience around, building inclusive teams and a culture of inclusivity. So we've both worked around the areas of D&I. However, we don't profess to be experts at all, do we, Paul?
No, that's not our thing.
However, we do want to share some of our sort of deep research really around, how do you build inclusive teams? And one of the key aspects really of building inclusive teams, which we're going to talk a lot more about in this webinar, is building relationships and connection. So we'd like to start with that. And Claire mentioned that you can add in on your sort of chat in the Q&A box. So we'd like you first of all just to have a think about what are you most grateful for now? What are you most grateful for now? And if you could post that in the Q&A box. So what are you most grateful for now? And then Claire will let us know as soon as we start to get some responses in the Q&A box. And while we're waiting for that, Paul, what are you most grateful for now?
I'm going to say my 3 teenage daughters, even though last night they were fighting. If they hear this here, they're going to be very cross. But yeah, I think that's part of family life. But just really enjoying having them at home at the minute, and also dreading them going to university. So so it's all good. Yeah, that's what I appreciate and really, really grateful for right now.
Great. And Claire, me, it's definitely family, that everyone's fit and healthy and well, and and I've got most of them here as well at the moment, but not necessarily under their choice. But, so most of them are here. So Claire, anything we're seeing in Q&A?
Yeah, actually a lot of people are mentioning time with family, and that's come up quite a few times, and also Lucy having their dog around and being able to get out on long walks. Also what you've mentioned, just that everyone is healthy, and actually people mentioning their team, their children being at home, happy, healthy family. I think that's having a job I love. That's a great one.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of and simple things like a morning coffee before work. I'll agree with that one.
Yeah, absolutely. It's focusing on the things that are important to us and that we're grateful for. Lovely. Thank you so much for starting to share. So it's something really simple, but we're going to be doing more and more sharing as we go through the session. So we'd really like to continue that theme of connecting and really hear a little bit more about your experiences in terms of diversity and inclusion. And we'd love you to respond to a couple of questions. Now, for this, we're going to use mentee.com. So you'll need another device. So grab your phone if you've got that. And all you need to do is you need to go onto your browser and then type in www.mentee.com. You should see the details on the screen. So if you just put www.mentee.com, and then you'll find the code there that you're going to be using for these questions. We will use it again later. So this code's a sort of one-time code for this piece. So that's 6031060. And we will be shortly moving to Mentee. So the first question on Mentee is, can you think of a time you worked in a team and didn't feel included? And what words describe how you felt? So just pop in some words that describe how you felt when you worked in a team when you didn't feel included. I'm doing it as well.
I'll do the same as it. And just to say, if anybody can't use Mentee, just put into the Q&A the answer to the same question, and then we'll check in with Clare to see what people have said. So
we've got one there already. It's starting to come in. So yeah, we've got a few that we're seeing here. So yeah, lonely, a lot of people saying lonely, alienated, yeah, undervalued, sad, yeah, unsupported. What else are you seeing there, Paul?
yeah, like it's really strong words like sad and lonely, or ignored, frustrated. They're strong emotions.
Yeah, absolutely. It's tough, actually, isn't it? It's really tough when you don't feel included.
We've got a few comments in the chat. Lucy, isolated,
Claire, yes. Yeah,
isolated, embarrassed.
Thank you for sharing, Claire. Yeah, so we can see some really key themes there, can't we? Sort of frustrated, lonely, isolated, sad, demotivated are some of the ones that are coming out really strong there. Undervalued as well. So as Paul said, some really strong emotions that makes you feel. Okay, great. And we're going to be definitely looking at, how do you make sure that, teams are more inclusive to avoid some of these feelings and the strength of these feelings as well. So the next question on Mentee is, in terms of D&I, what areas do you find it most difficult to talk about?
So just on your phone, you might have to go to slide or next question. Okay.
And again, if you're struggling on getting into Mentee, then just pop them in the Q&A, and Claire will fill us in. We've got a few starting to come through there. Raising the issue, the terminology. Race, yeah, using the right language. Okay, understanding each other's. There's a lot there about actually having the conversation, isn't there?
Absolutely.
And definitely some links there to the sort of the terminology that you use as well.
Yeah, wording, same thing, isn't it? Neurodiversity.
Yeah.
One which we mentioned later on.
Oh, scope there, isn't there? There's mental health, there's race, there's gay, there's just a whole inclusion, asking for help. Yeah, absolutely. Religion. There's lots more coming through there.
Somebody's putting there being non-binary. There's so many things. Yeah. Religion, yeah, it's another one that people find difficult to talk about. Folks, thank you. That's amazing. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Claire, anything else in Q&A that we haven't captured?
Kind of backing up what are there, you know, personnel issues, race is coming up, talking about gender, feeling embarrassed, so it's difficult to talk in the first place.
Yeah, absolutely.
Raising sensitive issues where many want to ignore things.
Yeah.
Big thing.
Thank you so much for sharing. And so we're going to take some of those themes really and think about, you know, how do you build a culture, a feeling in teams of inclusivity, so actually people feel more safe and comfortable to talk about some of these really challenging issues that people have raised. So thank you so much for that. That was brilliant. So I'm going to pass to Paul now, and Paul's just going to talk about our journey today and you know, what else we're going to cover. So in terms of our journey today, we're going to look at a little bit about what is diversity and inclusion. We're then going to look at, you know, so why build diverse and inclusive teams? What's some of the data around that? And then a little piece around, you know, what's some of the brain science of inclusive teams? And then moving into, you know, how can team coaching help actually? How can team coaching help build inclusive teams? And we'll share some very practical tools and examples as well, and techniques that you can use. So, okay. So first of all, it's talking about, you know, so what is diversity and inclusion? And many of you will absolutely know that, but it's also just saying that for some of the, where there's a confusion, it's useful just to, you know, talk about what's the difference really. So you see a definition. Oh, actually, of course, you haven't got the slides up. So Paul was sharing a definition actually by Bill Crawford, a psychologist, which states that diversity is about a state of being different, and it isn't the same as inclusion. So one is a description of what is, while the other describes a style of interaction essential for effective teams and organisations. So yeah, inclusion is about, you know, what you do to help people feel more included, and, you know, what actions and strategies you adopt as teams and as organisations to make sure people feel that they're included. And there's a sort of equation around, you know, diversity plus equal access will equal a feeling of inclusion. So it's very much about, you know, how do you create this culture that makes people feel more included?
There was one question here at the start, Lucy, that came in while we're waiting for the slides to come up, which I think is just a general thing, and I think probably worth them, and you were probably going to go on to it in the slides, but what's the value of building inclusive teams, the value to an organisation, and, you know, presumably the value potentially to you know, the individuals as well in those teams? Yeah,
absolutely. So it was the next piece I was going to come on to. So there was a great study actually by McKinsey in 2018, and it found that companies in the top quartile in terms of ethnic and cultural diversity were 33% more likely to perform on profitability. So, you know, huge benefits there from having, you know, diverse workforces and diversity of thought within teams. And they also highlighted sort of 5 key top benefits for teams and organisations of having more diverse teams. So that was that, you know, you win the war for talent, you increase employee satisfaction, improve the quality of decision making, increase innovation and customer insight, and obviously also as an output of that, improve the company's global image as well. So some really, really key you know, outputs and benefits there for the organisation. And then, you know, team coaching also really helps build inclusive teams, because in team coaching and the principles of team coaching, you're building safety, you're building trust, you're building connection, and enabling feelings of inclusion and the ability to have more open and honest conversations. And diverse teams are also able to have more, you know, diversity of thought as well. So you're leveraging that as a positive. So a lot of teams that I'm working with at the moment, a lot of global teams, you know, they're culturally so different in terms of ethnicity as well. And initially they're seeing it as almost a bit of a challenge. So the opportunity is really to think about how do you leverage that and use that to your advantage.
Yeah, so there is a, there's a commercial benefit from all organisations.
Paul.
Okay. So hello, folks. I'm actually here, and the joys of technology. So what we want to talk about here is this idea of what we call the brain science of inclusivity. And there's three areas we want to talk about. The first thing is threat and reward. And you may have heard about the part of the brain called the amygdala, or it's this limbic part of your brain at the back of your head. And it's constantly scanning the environment for threat. You've heard of fight, freeze, flight, things like that. And your brain is constantly asking the question, am I safe? Am I going to be okay? And each human being is just trying to survive. And what, but the good news is the brain is also scanning the environment for positive things like trust and love and excitement and joy, okay? And there's a little bit in between, which they call the startled surprise piece. So human beings are either trying to move away from things that scare them, or trying to move towards things that bring them joy and happiness and love, okay? But the brain has got this disposition towards negativity and threat. And I've heard one neuroscientist talk about our brain scanning the environment 5 to 8 times per second for threat. Can you imagine that? Okay, it's quite incredible. It's quite incredible. The second thing is this idea of implicit bias. Okay, so we've got this situation at the minute whereby our conscious, implicit bias means our conscious and unconscious preferences. And in a project in 2019 called Project Implicit, some 25 million people have given in results in terms of different tests. And the next bit I'm about to say, I find this difficult to say, but it's what the results show, is that as an overall population, there's a preference that people show, and from a bias point of view, for lighter skin, for people who are thinner, for straight relative to gay, for young relative to old. And that's even hard to say, okay? And it's an uncomfortable truth. I use that word. And actually they say on the test, if you're unprepared to interpreting these results, please don't even go any further, because they know it's going to be difficult for people. Another piece I want to mention, this third bit, is in-groups and out-groups. And we need in-groups. When human beings first roamed savannas, they got together to hunt resources, to share information, to gain competitive advantage over other groups. And it's the most human thing in the world is to do that there. And if you fast forward to today, if you walk into a room full of strangers, we start to go towards people who are like us. Now, not everybody, but in general, human beings go to people like us. Look where we live. Look how we live together in different communities and how we gather. And it's based on, it can be on education, professional status. It can be based on income, race, gender, a number of different things. We tend to go towards people like ourselves. And these are natural phenomena in the brain, okay? It doesn't mean it's right, but they're natural phenomena. So the question is, what can we do? Okay, what can we do? And we need, there's a couple of things thankfully we can do. The first thing is this idea of moving from threat and reward towards what we call developing team psychological safety, or you call it group psychological safety. I want to talk about groups, but team psychological safety. And psychological safety is defined as a shared belief that the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. Okay, this is a climate characterized by being able to take risks and that it's all okay, and it's all okay, and you can say what you're thinking and you feel that you're part of what's happening. And I guess the question I'd ask everybody today is, like, how much of yourself do you bring to your work? How do you help how do you help others bring themselves to work? Okay, do you help people feel safe? The second area I want to mention is this area of developing empathy. So this area of implicit bias, how do we overcome that? And there's lots of different things you can do, but one thing really powerful is the whole thing of developing empathy. And I want you to think of one thing, what empathy is, not sympathy, okay? And empathy, it involves entering the private perceptual world of the other person and then being able to communicate back to that person in some way that you understand. Now you think about that, can we really ever understand an other person's world? Okay, so true empathy at its deepest level is really, really difficult, but that does not mean we should not try. And the good news is, whilst human beings have different levels of empathy, we can develop empathy by practicing it. So I'm going to give you one tip of how you can do this. Tonight, when you're watching the news and you're listening to a position of one particular politician, and say you support that politician, but you don't support the second politician comes on, I want you to think of the person that you're opposed to and try and get into their world. Try and imagine what it'd be like being them. Okay, now it's difficult, you're not going to be able to communicate back, but then try and think, what would you say to them if you met them? Okay, it's just a different way of thinking, and that's how you develop empathy, is just by practicing really, really deep empathy. Research also has shown that higher levels of empathy within a team. So if you develop your empathy levels in team members, there's higher levels of empathy shown to out-group members, people in other groups, not of your group. And the last thing is this idea of to overcome in-groups and out-groups. The key here is to agree on purpose, values, and beliefs. So if you can focus on what can the team do together that cannot apart, what are they trying to achieve, why do they exist? And also values then, how do we want to behave as a group? So imagine disparate groups coming together all within one team. You have to ask the question, how are we going to behave together? What are we trying to achieve together? And the more we can do that, the more we can overcome little bits of in-groups and out-groups and come together. Okay, Lucy, so I'm going to hand over to the next section.
Great, thank you, Paul. So we're now going to start to look at how can team coaching help. So it's important probably just to touch base in terms of what is team coaching. So those of you who came to our previous Morgan Hunt webinar may be clearer on this, but a quick refresh if you're not, and for anyone that wasn't there. So what is team coaching? So first of all, if you look at what it's not so much of, so we will have all been on fun team building events where you build relationships and connection. However, the research says that often on a team building type event, you'll have a peak in terms of performance and team connection after that, but it will tend to actually then decline quite quickly. Whereas on the right, it's more like team coaching is a series of interventions working with the team. So it's about, helping the team really to look at, connecting back to what Paul just said, helping them to look at, what is their purpose? What are their values? What's the identity of a team? We'll talk a bit more about those in a minute. And then what are the relationships and the connections and rapport within the team? So it's a series of interventions. And we're just quickly going to show our definition. So Paul's going to put this up. We spent a long time, Paul and I, really trying to come up with, so what was our definition of team coaching going to be? And we wanted it to be understandable. So we did the Carrie test on this. So Carrie is Paul's youngest daughter. And as we were developing this, we kept checking in with Carrie to say, does this make sense? Do you understand what this means? So Carrie said she did. So this is our definition. I'll just let you read that for a moment. Okay. So we're going to be exploring a number of these areas, but really focusing more here on this sort of developing safe and trusting relationships. And that's to enable a more inclusive culture, and then for the team then to be more effective and efficient. So that's our definition of team coaching, and very much remembering it's about this series of interventions. So how does team coaching build inclusive teams? Well, our research identified 7 characteristics of high-performing teams, which we're going to very, very, very briefly talk about here. So the first is around, purpose. Paul mentioned purpose. So in terms of the team, why are they doing what they do? Who do they serve ultimately? Identity then is about how the team wants to be known and described. What's the collective identity of the team? Values and beliefs are about what does this team need to value and believe in order to achieve that purpose. Awareness is about how aware are the team of how they interface with the whole organisational system, with stakeholders, and within the team itself, what are the strengths and areas of development. Relatedness is this whole area of psychological safety, building relationships, trust, and enabling then open and honest conversations. Ways of working is about the processes and the rhythm of the team. So how effective they are at meetings, at decision making. And finally, last but definitely not least, transformation. That's about how the team continues to learn and grow with each other and innovate. That's where really that diversity of thought is really, really key as well. So those very, very briefly are 7 key characteristics. And today we're going to focus really on awareness and relatedness in relation to building inclusive teams. Okay, so we're going to start now by sharing some really simple tools that you can use in your work with teams to help build inclusivity. So the first exercise, we were going to use mentee, but based on the fact that we got kicked out before, I think, and lost connectivity, we'll probably won't stay with mentee, but we'll use Q&A. And so one of the key principles actually in terms of working with teams and building inclusivity and that feeling of safety is about connection before the work. So many teams we're working with are literally coming to meetings throughout and just jumping straight in on task. And actually what's really important here is to connect before the work and find out, you know, what is going on for people. I was running a leadership program last year and a very large organisation, and every time we came to the program, we asked the leaders, you know, to connect in and talk about how they were feeling. And there was a lot going on for people. And literally they said no one in any meeting they'd had in the whole organisation, in the whole time through lockdown, had ever asked them that, had never asked how they were feeling. So our first question here, we'd love you to put in chat, and Claire's going to keep an idea on, sorry, Q&A, is, you know, what's a word, if people ask you how you're feeling, what's a word or two that describes usually what you would say most often? So pop in chat. What do you say most often when people say, how are you feeling? Or how are you? What do you say? Paul, what do you tend to say?
The word that, well, I don't want to preempt what people are going to say, okay? But if somebody asks me, I say, yeah, I'm good. That's my sort of, I'm good.
Yeah.
I'm good.
And Claire, what do you tend to say?
Pretty similar. I'm fine. I'm good. Short and sweet. Yeah.
Good. What are we seeing in Q&A?
And nothing coming up yet. Oh, hang on. Fine. Busy. Fine. There's a lot of fine. There's a lot of I'm good. Yeah. Very similar. Oh, one person saying happy. That's good. I like that.
Good.
I like that. Yeah. Well done.
Fine. Thanks. How are you? I'm good. Thanks. I'm okay. All good. Yeah. You know, so that's what people are generally saying. Oh, overwhelmed. I like that.
Okay.
It's pretty honest.
Yeah.
For the times we're in.
And those tend to be the sort of responses that you get. So the next question is, how are you really feeling? And whether that's good or bad, that's absolutely fine. So I was on a call actually recently, and people were asking this question, and you know, actually a lot of people were not feeling too positive, and then someone actually piped up and said, well, I feel guilty, but I feel good. You know, I feel really positive at the moment. I feel actually optimistic. The sun's starting to come out. So whichever end of the spectrum you are is absolutely fine. But if you could perhaps post in, how are you really feeling right now? How are you really feeling? So
while we're waiting for that, Lucy, somebody has actually said just to the previous question, they say fine, but it's not a genuine reaction. It's what people expect them to say. So.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the really piece, you know, can make a difference, and the emphasis on that. So, Paul, how are you really feeling?
A little bit stressed, the fact that I crashed out and couldn't get back in again. I tried it 3 times, but I kept taking deep breaths and said, in the bigger scale of life, it's all okay. And we'll be okay. So I'm really glad to be here. But I'm actually grateful, and I think it's easy to get caught up in so many things. But there's a lot of stuff going on right around in terms of some friends at the minute whose family members are very ill. So I have that paradox of feeling quite good about life, but I'm surrounded with people in real difficulty, and so I feel joy and sadness at the same time. If that makes any sense, if I'm being honest.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's similar for me. You know, a friend of ours was diagnosed with cancer yesterday. So, you know, it's yes, positive and optimistic on one side, but actually on the other side, you know, really, really feeling, you know, just such, you know, empathy and you know, sadness for what they're going through. So, Claire, what are you seeing?
So we've got excited, autopilot, but I'm fine, fantastic, tired, giving generic answers, genuinely feel fantastic, that's great. Tired, stretched, I can't say the word, anxious, frustrated, a feeling of loss, disconnection. I think that's pretty common at the moment.
Yeah.
A lot of people saying tired, hanging on in there. I think, again, tired and underappreciated, which probably leads back to what you were saying, Lucy, about a lot of people not being connected with and asked.
Yeah.
And somebody saying the question needs to be asked a second time, but further into the dialogue, trust needs to be established.
Yeah.
Anxious and missing human interaction, lack of certainty. There's a lot here.
Yeah, so see how different that is actually, just with changing the emphasis slightly, and how important it is actually to make that connection before you jump in and just jump into task. You know, even if you're only asking that question, you know, every week or two, you know, at least to start, you know, really finding out what's going on for people. And, you know, some people are juggling, you know, trying to work with kids. I've been in so many meetings where people have got their toddlers on their lap and they're really struggling. So yeah, it's really great to have some openness and honesty. So I'm going to pass to Paul, and Paul's going to talk about some top tips to help maximise inclusivity as well.
Thank you, Lucy. And just before I move on to that, just that question you ask somebody, how are you? And they say fine or I'm good. If you follow that up very, very quickly within the next number of seconds, how are you really? And you genuinely mean it, you will find you'll have the most incredible conversations and the most incredible connection. Now, obviously, you have to want to know and have to want to give the time. But if you give the time to really seeing how people are feeling, you know, we do want to share this stuff, the good and the bad. So I'd recommend just starting to do that. It just really, really works. Okay. So the second tool we want to talk about is just 5 top tips. I'm going to ask some rhetorical questions then for you to focus on in terms of being able to use these here. And 5 top tips in terms of developing team inclusivity. Okay. And the first one, I don't know if any of you have come across a lady called Nancy Klein. Nancy developed this thing called time to think methodology. It's fantastic. Yeah, and she talks about, it's really, really, really good, really good. And said, until you've spoken, you haven't arrived. Until you've spoken, you haven't arrived. I want you to think of that, okay? I want you to think about going to a meeting. You're sitting there, it's 30 minutes in, and you haven't actually contributed yet. And what happens, the person can start to feel smaller and smaller and smaller, and the shoulders crunch, and it becomes more and more difficult to actually share, as if no one sees you. And there's a responsibility on leaders and everybody to try and say, to be aware of this here. And what Nancy talks about basically is getting voices in the room right away. Getting voices in the room right away. So this can take a question like we just asked her, how are you feeling, how you want everybody to share. It can be a simple 1-word check-in. It can be like everybody just share one thing, one word, how they're feeling. It can be one thing, share one thing that's going on in the business right now that you want to tell the whole team. Something to get everybody to contribute and get that felt sense of I'm arrived, I'm here, I'm important, I'm of worth. Okay, and folks, this works. This works, and we do this in the work that we do with teams and with leaders that we work with who do this with teams. Say, oh my goodness, that's just such a powerful thing, and yet so simple. And this means taking time out at the start, taking those 5-10 minutes at the start, putting it on the agenda if you have to. You know, that's worthwhile, and actually doing that. The second thing I want to talk about is non-violent communication. Yeah, sorry, the question I want to ask you about, sorry, on that point 1, that this idea of until you've spoken, you haven't arrived. I want you to think, where could you start to practice this? Where could you start to practice this? Okay. The second thing I want to mention is this idea of practicing non-violent communication. Marshall Rosenberg is the person that created this. If you want to go on the YouTube and type in Marshall, not right now, okay, but go on the YouTube and type in Marshall Rosenberg non-violent communication. There's lots of clips of him speaking about it. And there's one particular one where he goes into Palestine and he's talking to Palestinians who are talking about what's going on in their lives. And because he's from America, he gets quite a hard time. And he starts to ask the people he's speaking to, he said, like, tell me, what are your needs? And they start to talk about what their needs are. And within 1 hour, he's having dinner with people. So it went from total anger to having dinner with the people that were angry at the very, very start. And human beings have physical needs, we've got security needs, but we've also got deep psychological needs. So we've a need for relationships with each other. And we've a need for a sense of autonomy, sense of choice. We don't like being told what to do. If I give you a hot plate and say, do not touch that hot plate, there's a very good chance you'll touch it. Human beings are born to create and to think and to have a sense of autonomy. And we like to, we like to grow and develop. We like to keep developing and growing, this need for competence. So we have these really deep needs as human beings, really deep needs. And the idea of non-violent communication is listening beyond what the person is actually saying, if that makes any, I know it sounds contradictory, but you're listening beyond the words. You're trying to see, what does this person, so the other thing, take a baby who's crying. The baby is trying to communicate a message of some sort, okay? So what are the needs that the baby has, and and the parent tries to meet the needs of the baby. So in the same way, what needs are people communicating by their actions, by their non-verbal actions, etc., etc. And the question I want you to think of, what could you start listening, for beyond just words? What are the needs people are actually maybe trying to communicate that you're not hearing? Maybe acting out certain ways. What are they trying to communicate that you're not hearing? The third thing is something I just, Lucy and I both love this here topic. It's called conversational turn-taking, okay? And again, it's based on research as well. And it's just so strong. And this idea of what we call collective intelligence. Collective intelligence is the idea that a group will perform better than the smartest individual, and has been proven in research time and time again. And the key thing that improves this collective intelligence is what we call conversational turn-taking. And what it effectively means, this idea of, at a very simple level, everybody having a turn to speak. And I can imagine, when we work with teams and leaders, people say, oh, it takes so much time, but yet when you do it, the results are exponential. And the research shows that basically, if you practice conversational turn-taking, your team will perform better, you'll make better decisions, and you'll be more creative. Okay, what's not to want in doing those things, okay? And how do you do it? Well, it's as simple as it sounds. You let everybody take turns, and it's a bit like the first point until you've spoken, but this is actually during the meeting, during your time together, and it's getting everybody involved. I'll just give an example of an exercise last week I done with the team. We used a virtual whiteboard called Jamboard. I asked everybody, a particular challenge the team had, I asked everybody to think in silence, to put their views on a post-it note on the virtual Jamboard in silence. We then grouped them in silence, and then everybody had a turn to speak their truth, to speak what they've been thinking. So if you think what happened there, people were given the opportunity to think in silence, to put it in words in silence, and then to speak, okay? And what happens, and what the feedback we get, the quietest person in the room goes, wow, I felt included, I felt involved. The person who's maybe more extroverted says, wow, I felt liberated that I didn't have to speak. Okay, so this works on so many levels. So the question I have is, who is getting most of the airtime in your team? And how could conversational turn-taking help? Okay, just want you to think of those couple of points, okay? The third point is this idea, this replacing but. A lot of times we will say something and we go but, and it's sort of a negative way to sort of like have the conversation. So instead of going but, try and replace it with the words yes and. So this actually comes from theatre and improvisation, and it's being used quite a lot in business now. It's about having more positive and more inclusive conversations where we're actually building in people's ideas rather than shutting people's ideas down. A lot of time people, do not feel listened to. So for example, if somebody says an idea, you say, yes, what I really like about that is this, and I'm also thinking this could be a build on what you've just said, instead of going, but, and this more negative thing. And the question I have for everybody is, how could you become more conscious about the conversations that are taking place in your team? You might use this technique or another technique, but just becoming more conscious of the conversations. Look out for the words that are limiting inclusion. Look out for the words and the phrases that are not letting people feel involved, okay? And the last thing I want to mention is this thing about support before challenge. And what we mean by this here, human beings are not very good at taking feedback. Remember, I mentioned earlier on about threat, the fact that we live in this state of constant threat and we're seeking reward. And what happens when we give feedback, the same neural pathways in our brain light up when we feel social pain as when we feel actual physical pain. Is that not just scary when you think of that? It's like, when you're saying something to somebody that's hurtful words, it can be the same as physical pain in terms of neural pathways in your brain. I just find that amazing, that piece of research. And this idea then of support before the challenge, people have to feel supported before you can give them challenge. And this is what we mean here is that a culture whereby your intention towards a person is so pure that you can say, listen, I really want to give you this feedback, and they know that you care about them and it'll be received. But the reality is, even if your intention is pure, getting feedback can be very, very difficult. And it can be much better for a person to actually ask for feedback and say, what do you want? What feedback would you like to give me? So the question I have for everybody, who could you ask for feedback from on the ways in which you could be more inclusive? Yeah, just thinking about your own inclusivity. Who could you go along and say, you know, can you tell me about how inclusive you think I make people feel? And any tips? And if it's better for you to ask that question to be able to receive it than somebody might be saying it to you. But also there's times where we have to give feedback as well. So those 5 things, folks, we use these here a lot in our work as team coaches. We help leaders use these techniques, and all of these are all proven in science. But even forget about the research and forget about all that, these things work. Okay, and if you want to build more inclusive teams, I would really recommend really strongly adapting these practices, and you will transform how inclusive people feel in terms of, and also your team performance will escalate as well. So I'm going to hand over to Lucy now for the next piece.
Thank you, Paul. So building on that, another key characteristic that we see in terms of high performing teams is having open and honest conversations. So we have a few scenarios that we wanted to share with you and hear your responses in the Q&A. So Claire's going to be looking out on this one. So we've got a few different scenarios here, and we just love that, you know, there can be lots of different responses to this, but we'd love to hear, you know, some of your views, really open and honest dialogue just about, you know, what you would do in certain situations. So the first one is Amy in a team meeting uses an incorrect terminology for a colleague in another team, saying Joe the blind person. What do you do? What do you do? So we just love people to start popping in Q&A, you know, anything, you know, we won't be posting these after or anything, but just great to hear what people's responses to that. So you know, these are sort of things that happen in real time at work. You know, what do you do? Claire, anything at all?
Nothing's appeared as yet, Lucy. And just I think people are typing. It's probably a little bit longer to think about it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So what would you do?
Somebody's just said, actually, just on the previous point, Paul was talking about replacing but with yet. So I've got a few things now. Offer an alternative term of visually impaired to Amy.
Yeah.
Politely correct Amy and move on.
Yeah.
Respond using the correct terminology. Paraphrase to clarify. Someone saying challenge the language. Apologize to Joe and immediately correct Amy. Take Amy aside, tell her honestly in a nice way, constructively.
Yeah.
Correct Amy during the meeting in an appropriate manner.
Fabulous.
Yeah, so
I think and all of those things, you know, the key here is about having a conversation. So not letting it go is to have the conversation in an appropriate way. Because actually, remember back to the very beginning when we did the mentee slide before we got knocked out, you know, everyone was saying actually that was one of the most difficult things, you know, around a whole load of different terminology, isn't it? You know, so it is difficult, isn't it? And a lot of people, you know, are unsure on some terminology. So yeah, absolutely, having that open and honest conversation, I think, is really key. So some really great responses there. So
just one thing on that. Yeah, there's I've done some work with different teams where so somebody, for example, hearing impaired was a term that we thought we should be using, but actually people in the team who were from the deaf community said we don't like using that word, we want to use this word instead. So there's something here, but actually, even though you might read somewhere this is what you should say, actually checking in with people, you know, what term do you want to use, what term makes you feel most comfortable, because there's not total general agreement on every single term, and just not to assume that. It's just something that I struggle with sometimes, and it's why I probably said earlier on, terminology is quite a difficult area to try and get our heads around sometimes. So just talking about it even is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so the second scenario is every time a min makes a suggestion, another team member, Tom, ignores them and speaks over them. What do you do? And I'm sure this is a common one that happens in different meetings, certainly ones I see. So a min's made a suggestion, but every time they seem to make a suggestion, it gets ignored by Tom and they seem to be spoken over. So what do you do? Claire, people are probably typing again. It just takes a while to come through, doesn't it?
Yes, that's right, Lucy. I think somebody did answer that earlier, but it's so many comments coming in, it's hard to just quickly. So
while those are coming in.
Oh yeah, so Tom needs to be reminded that he's stepping into someone else's time. Stop Tom and hand back to Amin. Say to Tom, can Amin make a contribution, please? Yeah. I mean, as somebody is saying, look, in a hostile work environment, it can prove difficult to talk that openly.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then maybe saying, look, Tom, I think Amin has something to say. Can we let him talk? So trying to help him in by referring back to him and encouraging him to make the point.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an ideal opportunity. So if you've done some work as a team, if you're using sort of the team coaching principles, so you've done some work as a team around team values or a team charter, which is sort of, you know, your behaviours, how you want to behave. This is an ideal place to pause and reflect, you know, and actually just say, you know, how are we demonstrating these values? What are we doing that's in line with those values, and what are we doing that gets in the way here? So this, you know, this could be an ideal opportunity, as people said, you know, to have that open and honest conversation in the team, and you know, and to talk about, are we hearing everyone's voices here? So yeah, so some great responses there again, thank you. And then the final one is, you've got a culture of all going to lunch together when you're in the office, or if you're working virtually at the end of a Friday. But Ray doesn't join in. What do you do? So if one of the team's not joining in, what do you do?
So people are saying, check with Ray why he does not want to join and give appropriate support. So people are saying maybe to take him aside independently and just check in.
Yeah, absolutely. And Paul, this was just quickly, this was a real scenario that you were dealing with, wasn't it?
Yeah, so we've done some work in the area of autism, and we had an individual in the autism spectrum. And when you get that conversation of needs, what are your needs? For the person concerned, that hour of lunch break, that was their sanctity. That was their period of silence that they needed to try and calm their mind and really help them. And once the team understood that, everything changed. Everything changed. So back to this thing, what are our deeper human needs? You know, everybody's an individual, and yes, we're trying to be a team, but for that team to be a real team, it had to appreciate some of the individual needs of members. And once everybody got that, people were really supportive. And it wasn't that somebody wasn't going to lunch, it was somebody was doing what they needed to get through the day.
Yeah, and that's kind of what people are saying, you know, talk to that individual, talk to Ray one-on-one. Is there an issue individually with him? And if you know, if he's comfortable with that, then leave him to that, but just empathize and make sure you're checking in, that there's not something you need to be aware of. Yeah,
absolutely. So great. So some fabulous responses there, and very much, you know, the key here is about having the conversations, you know, and having that, you know, that openness, that honesty. Fabulous. Thank you for that. I'm going to pass to Paul. We're going to do very brief reflections because we're conscious of time, and we wanted to have some time for questions as well. So Claire, you could start having a look at the questions. We'll move on to those shortly. So Paul.
Yes, just two quick reflection questions, and you can share these in the chat if you want, or just reflect upon them yourself. But I want you to think of a time, you know, a team that you're a part of, and what can you do to help that team be more inclusive? Okay, and hopefully you've already been thinking that there throughout the webinar. So what can you do to help that team be more inclusive? And the word, we put the word, you probably can't see it there, but the word "you" is in bold. And the second reflection question is, when you get back to work, so if that's leaving the chair or whatever it is in the next 10-15 minutes, what will be the first action you will take to improve team inclusion? What will be the first action you will take? Okay, they're both similar type questions, but one's a little bit more about, you know, what's the first thing you're going to do? Okay. So we're going to go into the Q&A now. So those are things to reflect upon. I'm going to go into the Q&A, and then also, Claire, if any answers come to those reflections, and by all means, we can share those as well. That'll be fantastic.
Of course. So one question here: there will always be individuals who are resistant to change. how do we bring them around to be part of a team? So it's probably a more general kind of team coaching question. To Lucy, would you like to take that one?
Sorry, Claire, would you mind repeating that?
Sorry, I'll repeat it again. Yes, of course. There will always be individuals who are resistant to change. How do we bring them around to be part of a team? So presumably they're resistant to engaging with the team and working, or maybe more generally, as an inclusive team. How do you bring those individuals around, Lucy?
Yeah, absolutely. So if we were running a team coaching program, what we would do is right at the outset, actually, we would have one-to-ones with all the team members. So we would really get, around some depth of understanding around, what is it that's going on for them in terms of the team. And actually, even just recently at a new team I'm working with, I had those one-to-ones, and one of the team members said, I'm in principle, I'm happy with the team, program, etc. However, I feel uncomfortable actually talk about anything personal at all and to display anything personal. And so we had an open and honest conversation around that and talked about, well, actually, you're at choice in terms of how much you choose to disclose and share when we have those sort of exercises. So that, that's one opportunity, is engage people and engage them through the whole process as well. And I don't know, Paul, have you got anything else to add in terms of the resistance to change piece?
Yeah, well, one of the big things when we're team coaching is that we co-design the team coaching journey with everybody who's going to be involved in that, that piece of work, so people are involved in it. And back to, I said earlier on about this thing about autonomy. When you believe you've got choice into something and you feel you've got choice, you have a much better chance of taking part. Another part as well is just to realize that you can't bring everybody with you. It will be difficult at times, and you do not. I can think of one piece of work whereby I don't want to be confidential, but a person was going through a pretty significant mental health challenge in their life, and that was actually affecting everything in their life. But you would never have seen that, and it took about 10 years for them to go to the doctors and actually start getting help. But so it's just to really, I'd say, be compassionate as well. Be compassionate and realize you do not know what is going on in people's lives.
Great, thank you, Paul. I mean, this question has kind of been asked a couple of different ways, but it's addressing engaging your leadership team. So any tips around engaging the leadership team members? Some people are completely on board with building more inclusive culture, and some just don't appear to see the value. And what tips would you have to bring those on board, particularly with any diversity and inclusion initiatives that the general business is looking to engage with? Because if it doesn't start at the top, we talked about this in our first webinar, it's really difficult to drive that change if there's no buy-in from senior leadership. Lucy, would you like to take that one?
Yeah, that's fine. So I think, it's remembering that, people are influenced by, different pieces. So some people will influenced by data. So we talked about earlier about some of the data. So for example, that McKinsey study, some people will be influenced by the fact that, companies in the top quartile will have 33% higher profitability from ethnic and more diverse teams. So they might be influenced by that. Others might be influenced by the benefits in terms of the organisation. So sharing some of that research will help for some. Others talking about, well, actually, what does that look like? Helping them see it, bringing it to life for them, doing some work. If you do some work with the top team, often that absolutely gets the buy-in, and then those team members become champions. I've worked with some senior leadership teams where you've had, you might have had a real cynic in the team, and yet actually when you start doing the work and you engage them, they're absolutely part of it. That in one particular instance, that person became the biggest champion, and actually decided they wanted to cascade it across the organisation as well. So definitely remembering that people are influenced in different ways, I think.
Great, thank you, Lucy. And just referring back to one of the key topics and points you were both mentioning earlier, somebody's asked a question around trust. So trust seems to be key in building relationships in the workplace, but it takes time. So any kind of tips to accelerate that, I guess, and build trust, I guess, particularly when we're working remotely, as we all are now. Paul, would you like to pick that one up?
Yeah, I like to think of trust a bit like love, okay? And it's something that just doesn't arrive. It takes lots of little actions to build it up, okay? And I would say slowly. So keep connecting, check-in calls with colleagues, keep asking how are you really, making time for that, having purity of intent towards other people, listening to people's needs. So all of these little things all done, all build to that level where people feel that trust building, okay? And it's not just one thing. And yes, you will meet individuals. Sometimes you just connect and that's it. But for most of us, we have to work at relationships. And just one thing that to say that the deeper your peer relationships are at work, has been linked to your mortality rates. It's really important to work in this here. It's worth investing in. It's really important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
Conscious of time. Wow.
Yes. Do you have anything to add to that, Lucy, or?
No, well, actually, yes, I suppose. So one quick thing is just saying that actually it does take time and it is slow to build trust, but actually you can also accelerate that as well. So by, bringing the team together and, having exercises where people are sharing and you're creating that safe space for people to share, it can shift quite quickly as well. Yeah. So, if you take sort of positive action to help it to shift and help people to share, then actually trust can develop quite quickly.
Right. Thank you, Lucy.